The mountains do not care about your stories. They do not listen to your prayers or your screams. They are ancient, cold, and hungry. In the town of Silver Plume, Colorado, the peaks don't just loom over you. They press down like the lid of a stone casket. The year was 1988. A year of heat and dust and secrets that should have stayed buried in the old silver mines. Keith Reinhard arrived in this town looking for a different kind of life. But the mountain was already looking for him. Silver Plume sits at 9,000 feet above the level of the sea. A place where the air is thin enough to let the ghosts through. It is a town of weathered wood and rusting iron. A place that feels like it stopped breathing a century ago. Keith was a man of words. A journalist who thought he could capture the soul of the wilderness on paper. He took over a small shop that had once belonged to another man. A man named Tom Young, who had vanished into the same thin air just a year before. The floorboards in that shop groaned under Keith's weight, as if they were trying to tell him to run while he still had his shadow. He became obsessed with the empty space Tom Young had left behind. A hole in the world that Keith was slowly, inevitably filling. The mountains around the town are made of granite and spite. Pendleton Mountain rises like a jagged tooth against the bruising purple of the twilight sky. It is a place where the wind whistles through the pines like a flute made of human bone. A sound that gets under your skin. On the 7th day of August, at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith Reinhard closed his shop and told his friends he was going to the top of the mountain. He said he would be back by nightfall. But the mountain had other plans for his evening. He was wearing light clothing, a simple jacket and sneakers, as if he were walking to the corner store instead of into the mouth of a god. The sun was hanging low, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the scree slopes like spindly, black spiders. As he climbed, the sounds of the town began to fade. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of engines replaced by a silence so heavy it made his ears ache. The trail was a narrow ribbon of dirt that seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied the maps. As if the earth were rearranging itself beneath his feet. The trees up there are twisted by the wind into agonized shapes, their branches reaching out like desperate hands clawing at the sky. Keith kept moving, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps that tasted like copper and old snow. There is a point on the mountain where the light changes, where the gold of the sunset turns into a sickly, bruised grey. He reached the timberline, a place where nothing grows and the wind never stops its mournful, low howling. He looked back toward the town, but the valley was filled with a thick, unnatural mist that swallowed the lights of Silver Plume. He was alone, truly alone, in a landscape that felt less like earth and more like the surface of a dead moon. The rocks under his feet were slick with a moisture that had no business being there. A cold, oily film that smelled of wet fur and ancient decay. Every step felt like a gamble. Every heartbeat, a countdown to something he couldn't see. He reached the summit as the last sliver of the sun vanished behind the jagged teeth of the Rockies, leaving the world in a cold, blue shadow. The air grew still. So still that he could hear the sound of his own blood rushing through his veins like a river of lead. Then came the sound. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the very stones beneath his boots. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of the mountain breathing. He turned to descend, but the trail was gone, replaced by a chaotic jumble of boulders and deep, black crevices that looked like open mouths. The familiar landmarks had shifted. The ridge he had climbed was no longer where it should have been. Panic is a cold thing. It starts in the stomach and moves to the throat until you can't breathe. Keith began to run, his sneakers slipping on the loose shale as he scrambled into the deepening dark. The darkness in the mountains isn't like the darkness in the city. It is thick and tactile. It feels like it has weight and teeth. He called out, but his voice was swallowed instantly. As if the atmosphere itself were made of velvet, he saw something in the corner of his eye. A movement that was too fluid to be a deer and too large to be a man. It moved between the shadows with a grace that was sickening. A flickering shape that seemed to blend into the very air. In the world of the missing 411, people don't just die. They cease to exist. They walk behind a tree or over a ridge and they are simply deleted. The search for Keith Reinhard began the next morning. A massive effort involving hundreds of people and dogs and helicopters. They combed every inch of Pendleton Mountain. Every cave. Every ravine. Every square foot of the harsh terrain. The bloodhounds. Dogs trained to find a needle in a haystack of scents. Couldn't find a single trace of him. They wandered in circles, whimpering and tucking their tails between their legs as if they were terrified of the very ground. No clothing was found. No sneakers. No scraps of paper or drops of blood. It was as if Keith had stepped off the edge of the world and into a void where physics and logic no longer applied. The townspeople whispered about the curse of Silver Plume, about the mines that go deep into the dark heart of the earth. They remembered Tom Young, whose remains were eventually found in a place that had been searched dozens of times before. But Keith Reinhard was different. The mountain kept him. Maybe he is still up there. A shadow among the shadows. A voice in the wind that sounds like the scratching of a pen on paper. The mountains are not our friends. They are indifferent giants that sometimes decide to keep a souvenir. When you walk into the high country, remember that the trail behind you can vanish as easily as a breath in the cold air. This phenomenon is not isolated to the peaks of Colorado. It is a pattern that repeats across the wilderness of the world. In the Comanche Peaks wilderness, a young boy named Jaryd Atadero vanished in 1999, leaving behind only a few fragments of clothing years later in an inaccessible spot. Like Keith, Jaryd was there one moment and gone the next, as if the landscape had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. We look for answers in the dirt and the trees. But maybe the answer is in the air, or in the things that watch us from the places where the light doesn't reach. The mystery of the missing 411 remains a cold trail. A series of questions with no faces and no names. Keith Reinhard went looking for a story, and he became the most terrifying one of all. Be careful when you look too closely at the mountains, because sometimes the mountains look back, and they have a very long memory, and a very large appetite. The silence of Silver Plume is heavy tonight. The kind of silence that feels like an invitation to join the missing. Don't go into the woods after the sun goes down. And never go alone, because out there in the dark, the rules of the world don't apply. And the only thing that's certain is the cold. Sleep well. If the wind lets you. The searchers eventually went home. The helicopters stopped their buzzing, and the mountain returned to its ancient slumber. But the hole Keith left behind is still there. A gap in the fabric of reality that will never be patched. Every year, more people walk into the green cathedrals of the wilderness and never walk out. We call it a tragedy, but the mountain calls it a harvest. Stay on the path. Watch your shadow, and listen for the sound of the mountain breathing, because once it notices you, there is nowhere left to hide. The story of Keith Reinhard is just one page in a book written in blood and shadow. A book that is still being written today. If you find yourself in Silver Plume, don't look too long at the peak of Pendleton. You might see something looking back, and if you hear your name called from the trees, don't turn around. Just keep walking, and hope the mountain finds someone else to keep it company.